Thank you again for joining Michael and myself. I am Amy Scribner. I am the Director of Development and Communications for Bike Walk KC, and it is truly a pleasure to introduce my colleague who has taught me so much about policy, advocacy, work, coalition building, and really channeling my passion for certain issues into a more productive process, which he's going to share a bit with you tonight about basics of building an effective coalition. Again, just a little bit, if you could remain muted, and if you have questions that pop up, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will get to those at the end of the program, and as well as address some of the questions that were submitted when you registered. So thank you for that. All right, I think with that, Michael, I'll monitor the wait room if you want to get started.
Yeah, Amy, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who is joining us tonight to take part in Advocacy 103, Advocacy Training 103, the basics of building an effective coalition. And of course, there we go. As Amy mentioned, my name is Michael Kelly. I'm the Policy Director for Bike Walk KC. And really briefly, our mission is to redefine our streets as places for people to build a culture of active living. If you love social media, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Bike Walk KC. Check us out. So in terms of what we'll be talking about for the training session tonight, we're really going to cover 4 key areas. Number 1 is what is a coalition. Number 2 is building a foundation for that coalition. Number 3 is who to include. And finally, how to keep it going. So first question that we want to answer, first topic we want to cover here is, what is a coalition? And in short, it's a group of people and organizations with a shared goal. So first and foremost, a coalition is a group of people or organizations that are made up of people from various backgrounds. Successful coalitions often rely on a combination of people with varying interests and levels of expertise in a wide array of issues. They're also a group with a common goal. Despite these varying types of expertise and background, a coalition is a group of people and organizations unified by a common cause. Even within this common cause or goal, members of the coalition may have different views about how to get there and or what to do once that goal has been achieved. And finally, coalitions are often working towards something which can't happen immediately. Especially with active transportation, true change and progress can take months and even years. However, such work is often sparked by a key moment, like the example I'm about to share. So one of my favorite advocacy stories to tell is about North Kansas City Complete Streets. So after a year of community engagement and planning, the city of North Kansas City constructed the Armour Road Complete Streets project seen here. The project included improved transit stops, repaired sidewalks and decorative crosswalks, parking protected bike lanes, and more. A few drivers who didn't live in North Kansas City disapproved of the changes because it made them drive more carefully and complained to the mayor. In response, the mayor called for a special meeting where he planned to introduce legislation that would remove much of the project less than a month after it had been completed. Residents who had pushed for the project and safety improvements didn't want to lose these improvements, and so they reached out to Bike Walk KC for help. Bike Walk KC's advice was to build a coalition to save Armour Road. The residents leapt into action. Organized as NKC Complete Streets, they formed a coalition of neighbors, local businesses, riding groups, and other key stakeholders under a simple message: keep the project in place. They also took steps to raise the issue with local media, gather letters of support and petition signatures, and even organized a door-knocking campaign in the days leading up to the meeting. The night of the meeting came, and the coalition and their partners showed up in force. When it was all said and done, more than 40 people had spoken in favor of keeping the new configuration on Armour Road, and the City Council ultimately voted unanimously to keep the project in place. Today, Armour Road remains an example of complete streets for the region to follow, and North Kansas City is expanding its multimodal amenities because of the North Kansas City Complete Streets Coalition. So, with that idea in mind, with those basics kind of covered, let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about what it means to build a foundation. What are some of the key elements which make a strong coalition? The first part of building a coalition is deciding on your goal. The easiest way to do this is to ask yourself the following questions. Number one, what is the change you want to see? Regardless of if it's a policy, plan, or project, you need to be able to very clearly identify what it is that you want to change. This doesn't necessarily need to be exactly one item and one item only, but you want to keep this vision somewhat narrow so that there's a clear target to focus on for yourself and other members of the coalition. Why do you want to see this change? You also need to articulate why this change needs to happen. If it's traffic calming for an intersection, is it because data tells us that crashes and fatalities have occurred there in the past? If it's a citywide policy, is it because it aligns with the stated goals of the community in question? The change you and your coalition seek is important, but you need to tie it into a broader meaning to create something which more people can get behind. And finally, where would this change come from? It's important to define where the change will come from. Will the project be initiated by city staff? Will the policy be adopted by city council? Knowing where you need to go to push the change you seek is important because it defines who to focus your advocacy efforts on and the types of approaches you'll need to consider. Speaking of, which tactical style? It's also important to ask yourself, what kind of coalition do you want to be with regards to tactics? With regards to active transportation, many coalitions would categorize themselves and their activities as one of the following: behind the scenes. This involves working in a more low-key manner to build towards something over time, or direct action, which tends to be organizing openly and for an immediate push and change. These are very broad and oversimplified ways to organize these schools of thought when it comes to coalition building and advocacy. It's not uncommon to see groups incorporate aspects of both from time to time, and that's perfectly fine. Let's talk about each one of these tactics in a bit more detail. So let's begin by discussing the behind the scenes tactical style, where advocates tend to work in a more low-key manner to achieve the changes that they want to see. What does it entail? Working behind the scenes primarily involves working within the system to identify a path forward and pursue it. This often involves working through existing channels and having meetings that don't generate much in the way of headlines, but are still oriented towards a lasting change. Besides researching and working with staff and electeds to chart the path forward on an issue, it also involves taking steps to get partners to show up with letters and or public testimony. You can see examples of this work with local groups like the American Heart Association on anti-smoking legislation, for example. So because the objective is to work through the system in place, a behind-the-scenes approach lends itself to building stronger ties with internal champions. Especially from an active transportation perspective, this can be helpful when policies are adopted because it lays the groundwork to push for the subsequent plans and projects which are intended to flow from the policy. This tactical style does mean that change tends to take longer to achieve, however. Because of this, it can often be a challenge for coalition partners to remain fully committed to achieving change simply because of time or capacity constraints. On the other side of the spectrum is what is known as direct action. Direct action sounds very much like what it means. Coalition members working in the space take steps such as strikes, sit-ins, and demonstrations like the one shown here to achieve immediate results. A good example of an organization which often relies on this tactical style is the Casey Tenants. Though they work primarily on issues related to housing, they have used these tactics to achieve immediate goals like pushing landlords to make needed repairs and stopping eviction proceedings at the Jackson County Courthouse. So the advantage here is that it's geared to achieve quick change. By its very nature, direct action is loud, confronts the issues of the system in question, and is meant to achieve immediate action. When coalitions organize around these strategies well, it is possible to see these changes occur. This can work well for coalitions working to defend something, someone, or something, like stopping an elected official from dismantling a project, for example. So while a change is intended to be quick, it is also possible that it can revert to the status quo just as quickly. Unless there's some sort of institutional buffer, say a champion among staff, electeds, or legislative guardrails, there's not a guarantee that the change sought will be carried out or kept in place. This may necessitate further direct action in response. So be it either tactical style, neither is 100% good or bad. As a coalition, you have to decide which approach you want to take, whether that be one style over another or some combination of the two. So with that idea of the initial considerations, we now need to shift gears again and talk a little bit more about who to include. So how to identify and attract the partners that you want or need in your coalition. So when thinking about who to include in your coalition, there are some key questions that you want to ask on the front end, including who does your goal support? When you think about the end goal, whether it be as small as a stop sign or as big as a citywide policy, it's important to think about who will benefit from the goal being achieved. One way to think through this is to write down the benefits that flow from your goal, be it equity, health, safety, comfort, etc., and consider who else in that area wants those same things. Who must be included? Especially when talking about active transportation, it is essential to consider your coalition's work through an equity lens. That means thinking critically about how your policy could impact the most vulnerable people in your community. It means taking the time to determine how the work towards achieving your goal includes Black and Brown people, people living with disabilities, people living without access to cars, young people, and others. It also means taking the time to figure out how you will work to center and elevate those voices in decision making as a coalition. One final area of consideration for potential partners is thinking about who can help to convince decision makers. Regardless of whether you have an idea of which decision makers likely support the change your coalition is pushing for or not, take the time to consider which individuals or organizations have influence which can help to strengthen your coalition and your push for change. So even with asking these questions, you'll likely have a pretty long list of people and organizations that could fit within your coalition. The next few slides will help you to understand that a little bit further. So on the point about decision makers, it's a good opportunity to briefly discuss the idea of power mapping. Power mapping is where you work to figure out who has influence among the decision makers who must make the change you seek. Nothing, not even decision making, happens in a vacuum. It is almost always the direct result of influence placed and concentrated on the decision makers responsible for making a specific change occur. At every stage of a decision-making process, power mapping can be a helpful tool to determine who has influence with the decision maker and who should be included in your coalition to place and concentrate influence on a decision maker to achieve the change you seek. So we're going to do a bit of power mapping ourselves right now. Looking at the picture here, I want everyone to take a moment and provide me with some individuals or groups of people who might be influential on Councilmember Green's sticky note. So feel free to take a moment and just drop some suggestions, some ideas of who might be influential in the chat. Okay, neighborhood association of their council members. Yep, they're all good, good. They could be influenced by their families. Good point, Rebecca. Yeah, yeah, excellent. Okay, okay. So we have a few ideas here. So and of course, there we go. Okay, so here are a few individuals and groups that could influence Councilmember Green in his decision making. So the folks I have in blue may be different from what you wrote, and that's perfectly fine. Different people are going to have different ideas about who influences who, and that's a good thing. As I said earlier, you want to be able to cast a wide net, and power mapping is one way that you can do that. Now, looking at this map here, we all need to take a moment to ask ourselves, who are the individuals and groups which could influence the folks in blue? As with the last slide, I want everyone to take a moment to write down and offer up in the chat some ideas. There's people in the community. Good call. Okay. So going to the next one, we would have, oh, we have one more, residents of the other council members' districts. Yes, absolutely. So, and so, sorry, that's my place here. So things are getting a little crowded with all the sticky notes. Obviously, as you look at who can influence the folks who influence the decision maker, your net can get really wide really quickly. One other aspect I wanted to note on this stage, you may notice that some of the groups listed show up more than once. Even though the numbers overall will continue to increase, it is likely that similar individual or groups like friends or coffee shops will emerge as folks who can influence influencers or the decision makers directly. As those patterns emerge, make note of that because it can help you to prioritize which partners to pursue when you're finished with your power map. So once you've cast the net wide and done a little power mapping, you need to take some time to consider each individual and organization with a more critical eye. To begin, ask yourself some questions to try to gauge their internal capacity of joining your coalition. So before you ask anything of that partner, you need to ask yourself what the coalition brings to the table for the prospective partner. Does it give them an opportunity to notch a policy win? Does it help them to serve a portion of their constituency? Does this align with their broader mission? It's important to take this approach because it breeds humility. It makes it easier to approach a partnership as a true partnership rather than a top-down mandate. Second, it's not always enough to have a compelling win or tie-in with their message. You often need someone who will vouch for you and your coalition. Especially if you haven't worked with a prospective partner organization in the past, it can help to identify an internal champion to connect you with the leadership. Having the champion not only lends you a bit of credibility because someone else can speak to what you're doing, but the champion often knows how to discuss your topic in a manner that won't alienate the leadership. And finally, with supporting your ask, this speaks more to the organization's capacity. Not every organization is in a position to be able to advocate for something, even if it aligns with their mission and there are internal champions for it. Consider what tactics you want to employ for achieving your goal and try to see if this is something the partner in question has done before. Also consider whether the tone of your stance aligns with the usual tone of the potential partner as well. Some partners may want to be more forceful and some may want to be less so. You ultimately have to decide whether orgs in either camp are ones you want to approach the invite to your coalition. Beyond the internal elements of a potential partner, there are also external elements or how they can interact with you in the public that should be considered as well. So like a coalition, individual organizations typically don't work in isolation. They rely upon a network of individuals and smaller groups to help them achieve their goals. So take the time to consider who a potential partner may be, either to bring to the table, either through direct actions or through indirect connections and requests. Be mindful and respectful of the fact that some partners may not be willing to connect with individuals or organizations you identify and request connections with. Just as you need to consider the steps you take, you must also understand that your partners have to act in the same manner. Have they collaborated in the past? On issues related to the goal or goal you are pushing for, try to determine how the partner has collaborated with the organizations leading that push in the past. If a similar organization pushed for a sidewalk or stop sign installation in the past, how did the partner work with them? What did they say and what actions did they take on that issue? What was the outcome of their efforts? Even if their previous effort wasn't successful, it can still help to inform how you approach them and what you ask them to do when action is needed. And finally, how do they interact with decision makers on your issue? Have their interactions been in the tactical style you plan to take? Do they have relationships with decision makers that you don't have? While there are many factors which are critical to consider for a partner, whether or not a possible partner can help you secure majority support for your initiative is a big element to keep in mind. So, while the circumstances which approaching each prospective partner in a coalition will vary, there are still some general tactics to consider with each. Be prepared to listen. The most important tool to bring along in your outreach to prospective partner is a receptive ear. Far too often, coalition organizers see other people and organizations as a means to an end rather than an independent entity which has their own priorities. Going into a meeting prepared to listen to whatever a prospective partner has to say, whether it's related to your coalition or not, can be an endearing sign of respect and dignity. It can also give you insights to address potential concerns they can express. So explain the coalition. Explain to the partner the broad aspects of the coalition. What does the coalition hope to accomplish? How do they plan to accomplish that goal? And who they want to work with to reach that end goal. Being explicit and honest about all of this is critical. Much like individual introductions, you only get one chance to make a good and honest first impression. Leaving something out or being misleading can not only harm your chance of bringing that prospective partner into your coalition, but could lead to issues with other prospective partners as well. Align with their mission. Take the time to research an individual or organization and understand why you want them to join your coalition. Even if it seems obvious to you, it may not be obvious to them. Take the time to draw a very clear line between their work and the goal of your coalition. If possible, use some of the language from their own documents to help make the pitch. This not only demonstrates that you did the work to understand them and their cause, but can also paint a clear picture for them of how they can see themselves in your coalition. And finally, if time permits, don't make a major immediate ask. In the meeting with a request along the lines of, can we keep you updated of future opportunities with the coalition? Especially if this is the first time meeting with them, a small ask is a better way to hold interest, and it makes it easier to go back later for the big ask, whatever it may be. One other note, just because there are similar organizations with similar goals which may align with the work of the coalition doesn't mean they will want to join your coalition, and that's okay. Some organizations prefer to work on their own, and some may have tactical styles which don't align with yours. It doesn't mean it's inherently bad or good, it simply is what it is. So finally, let's talk about how to keep a coalition going. How do you build up steam and maintain momentum? So even if there isn't anything going on, it's a good idea to keep partners updated about what's happening and work towards coalition's main objective. Be sure to consider the following. Don't write a novel for what can be explained in a few sentences. If no major developments have occurred in a month, say that. But even when there is something happening, try to stick to basic information needed for a partner, timeline and key dates. where the decision is in the process, and a reminder of one or two key actions to take if they haven't done so already. Give timelines if possible. So whether it be a project decision or a policy decision, it can sometimes be challenging to gauge when things will happen. Regulations need to be reviewed, materials need to be assessed, and all of this is before you consider internal politics. Talk with staff and or decision makers to try to determine if there are internal issues, but also keep an eye on agendas for meetings. Especially if it's a policy, you can likely figure out when it will be considered by finding and following it on an agenda. Be sure to relay this to partners as soon as you know concrete information you can share. Offer to answer questions. Even if a partner is on board with being a part of your coalition, that doesn't mean they won't have questions from time to time. Especially when there is a lull in movement or ask from you, it's important to answer their questions as best you can. As we've said in earlier presentations, honesty is critical. In this instance, that means telling them when you know and acknowledging when you don't know something. If you don't know something, work to figure it out and get the requested information to the partner. And finally, adjust for turnover. Especially over the course of several months or a year, there will likely be some changes with the staff and contacts of the partner organizations which you're working with. If an internal champion or main point of contact is leaving, don't panic. Simply ask who will be the interim or long-term replacement and take the time to meet with them, give details about the coalition and their organization's role, and answer their questions. So while there may not be constant movement with your coalition's issues, there may be opportunities to support issues for individual members in the meantime. Do what you can. Not every advocacy request from a partner is something you can do, either because it may not fully align with your own mission or because it requires a level of effort or involvement you simply can't commit to. Even if you can't do everything that is asked, offer to do what you are capable of. Be sure to explain why the original ask is too much and follow through on the alternative support you offer. Even if it isn't everything a partner requested, it still helps with their own efforts and gives them a reason to continue supporting your goal. Encourage partners to join you. Remember that advocacy is a team sport. If there's something happening with a partner where it makes sense to bring in other members of your coalition, invite them to participate as well. This can be a way to not only bring additional support to a related cause, but it also helps to strengthen overall cohesion and understanding between members of the coalition. And as much as possible, tie indirect work with partners back to the work of the coalition, whether it be in comments, action, or otherwise. It's perfectly reasonable to tie efforts with partners back to the coalition's central goal. In many instances, doing so is helpful because it can help to demonstrate the broader appeal of your coalition's work. That not only strengthens your relationship with existing partners, it can also make a compelling argument for why others should join your coalition as well. So, one more element of work as part of a coalition is taking the time to reassess that work. How often this happens will vary from one coalition to another, but if time allows, it can be helpful to do the following. Document your efforts. Take the time to write down everything that you and your partners in your coalition have been doing. What meetings have you been to? Which decision makers have you met with? How have you worked to build community support for the change you seek? What opposition have you run into? Documenting your work is important because it gives you an opportunity to assess everything from the 30,000-foot view. When you're in the thick of an advocacy campaign, it's easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. Taking the time to document your efforts helps to keep you grounded. It also can be helpful for others who may want to follow and mimic your work in their own community with their own coalition. Measure the efficacy of your strategies. It's also important to honestly assess whether the tactics you've employed as part of this coalition are working or not. Have they been able to move the needle? Have they brought decision makers into your camp or at least gotten them off the fence? It's okay to admit when a strategy isn't working and to try something else. It doesn't mean that it's a failure. More often than not, a coalition is working with limited information and they have to make an educated guess. With more information, you can make a better guess, and that better guess can be, though isn't always, a different strategy. Finally, take the time to assess the partnerships which form the coalition. Have your partners done what you have asked as part of the coalition? Have you been able to support them as they need? Are you concerned that you may lose their support as time goes on? Like the bicycle in this picture, coalitions work well when all of the partners play their role as part of a bigger purpose. Some parts need more attention than others, and that is ultimately how you ensure cohesion and longevity. So as we close out tonight's session, I want to tell you one more story, this time about a woman named Emily. Emily writes, commutes matter. They set the tone for our workday and give us mental space to transition from work to play. They can pollute, create community, be adventures, be a drag. Like most things, they're largely what we make of them. When I moved to KC 13 years ago, our city's bike lanes were nothing more than lines on a map, and that's how they felt. I'm now biking my two littles to school, then myself on to work via 85% plus neighborhood streets and dedicated bike lanes. And I'm not alone. Family-friendly rad power bikes are popping up everywhere. Things like this don't just happen. A more pedestrian and bike-friendly city takes the hard work of committed organizations like Bike Walk KC and city employees and elected officials. From a deeply grateful working mom, thank you to all who work tirelessly to build a multimodal Kansas City. So I share this story to not only highlight how the work of coalitions that Bike Walk KC has been a part of can create real change for people walking, rolling, and biking in communities across our region. I share this because advocacy can be long and challenging and frustrating, and we can all use some motivation to pick up our feet and keep moving forward. So, before we go to questions, I want to take a moment to let everyone know that this training is not the final advocacy training we'll be doing. There will be one more advocacy training, that is AT 104, working with staff and electeds. So in this session, we will explore how advocates like you can work to develop and maintain effective relationships with staff and elected officials. You can also check out our previous recordings on other topics as well. Just hop over to our YouTube channel and you can see our recordings for Advocacy Training 101 and Advocacy Training 102. So with that, I want to thank you all again for your time, your attention, and most importantly, for your partnership. Advocacy, as always, is a team sport, and we're not able to do any of this without you. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. So I'm struck by just the amount of relationship building that goes into coalition building. And I think when I was younger, as a younger advocate, I just wanted to dive in, say, this is the right thing to do. Like, duh, why don't you get it? And let's go and just get the thing done. And over time, I've realized that you have to exercise such a level of patience, and that can be really disheartening sometimes for someone who is a bit more impulsive like I am. So,
Absolutely.
So I appreciate you really breaking it down in terms of where we need to tend to take a deep breath and dig into those relationships a bit, because you'll be more successful. We have, it's such a small group. We will open it up for you all to ask questions, but there were a few that came in from the registrations that I thought would be interesting to hear your perspective. There's one question about how to empower young people to come together to create coalitions. I thought that was interesting because young people can't vote. So are they even seen as, do they bring as much political capital to a coalition when you're trying to work with electeds?
The answer is absolutely. Going back to the North Kansas City example, one of the most powerful pieces of testimony actually came from a 12-year-old girl who specifically spoke about how the improvements along Armour Road in North Kansas City made her feel safer when she was not just biking to school, but also maybe if she wanted to go get some ice cream. And it gave her a level of confidence that she wouldn't otherwise have if that infrastructure wasn't there. So the thing that I want to say really with approaching youth is one, you just need to do it. Like I think a lot of times the reason that youth are kind of left out of the conversations is because no one takes the time to think, has anyone spoken to a group of school kids? Have you spoken to the neighborhood kids? Just being honest about the need to have that conversation is one step that I think is often overlooked. But the other part of it is being able to give them the space to talk about things frankly. It should not be, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, this sounds great, right? It should be, what is the specific change? What is your perspective on this? Because a lot of times we kind of assume that because we're adults, we know what's best for everyone, whether that be older adults or for children, and that's not ever the case. We should be taking steps as much as possible to create an open-ended conversation where there's room for true feedback and insight, because that's where you get the true kind of engagement that not only gives you better insights overall as a coalition, but really kind of hooks children, so to speak, in wanting to be involved in that work because they can now see themselves as being part of the solution that needs to happen in that community.
That's great advice. One other question that caught my eye with the registrations was the question about any tips for starting a coalition newsletter. How common is that, Michael?
Coalition newsletters, they vary a little bit. I will say in general, I think that they can be very, very good. Two things that I would just say, one is keep it brief. So coalition newsletters, like I had said earlier in the presentation, any sort of updates, you want to keep them brief. Don't get into the minutia, just give people opportunities to ask questions if they want. But the other part of it is, if you're going to start a newsletter, create it in a way that anyone else in the coalition can pick it up and run with it. Because far too often it's kind of created in such a way that it might be unique and it might be kind of catchy and everything, but if it's not structured in a way that anybody can just take and run with it, then it goes by the boards if the person who's been doing it is out of action or moves on to something else.
And that relates to, actually leads into one other question before, and Michael, if you want to turn off the slides, and then if folks want to get themselves off of camera, I'm totally fine after asking this question from registration if anybody just wants to unmute since we have such a small group. Someone asked, how do you get a second in command so everything doesn't stop if or when you can't drive things forward? So sort of a hierarchy of who's really driving the coalition and succession planning, I guess.
So with trying to figure out a second in command, it begins by making sure that you kind of have a core of folks when you're starting a coalition. You don't ever really want to start a coalition by yourself. You want it to be several folks who are all committed to the cause, who are saying, you know, we can work with this, because you second in command begins from having a well of people that you can pick from. So got someone who can't make it, X person is able to step in. It also means specifically doing things as a group. So as much as possible, everyone is able to see how things work. Everyone sees how things function. And so if the so-called leader is not able to do it, everyone else has seen how things work, who I need to talk to, who needs a little bit more attention, that they can carry that on because they know exactly what it looks like. They know exactly what they're supposed to do because they've been doing it as well, along with the so-called leader. And again, I say it again, write everything down, document everything, because even if people are still able to see it, if there's at least something that they can, you know, have tangible to kind of look at as they need, that can really make things easier for them to take on in the absence of a leader of a coalition.
Documentation is really important for sure,
Yes.
because a policy win or an advocacy win is not guaranteed for the long haul. So
Mhm.
if you want to preserve the wins that you have achieved in the here and now, in order to ensure that the next, a decade from now, 10 years from now, someone can go back and take a look at your notes and look at what your strategies were, in case they need to fight the good fight again, which does happen.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So we've definitely had instances where someone has had to pass the baton either because they're out of commission or because the circumstances have changed and they can't continue to do it. And what often tends to make or break with a coalition is how much were they cultivating their second in command or their kind of core group so that someone could step into that void. And that can really be the difference between whether something sticks around for another year or gets something done, or if it falls short.
Right. Well, Melanie, Rebecca, Megan, if you're comfortable coming off camera or popping in, this is a small group. So if you have specific questions about the work that you're doing, want to ask questions, discuss anything, we've got 15 minutes left. I'm happy to have you guys come off mute and do that.
Yeah, happy to answer any questions you might have.
I don't really have any questions, but I want to say thank you. That was a lot of useful information for somebody who's just starting to do, community service and outreach. And I really appreciated that. Was really useful.
Of course, of course.
Absolutely. I appreciate the same. So I work with Marlboro Community Land Trust, and we are looking to, based on being named the consultant for Mark to help grow the community land trust. Yep. We are going to need to build in different neighborhoods. So this was very helpful for me just to start thinking about, okay, who am I going to connect with?
Yeah. And I would say just with the coalition, with the Marlboro Community Land Trust, I would say if you are able to, start connecting like with local businesses. So I know that the borough's been one, Vines, Sweets and Treats would be another one to connect with. Center School District would be another partner to reach out to.
Yeah, absolutely. We are partnered with them on 2 of our new builds where we will specifically designate them for 2 of our new properties, Center School District.
Yeah. So, hi, Rebecca. And then Melanie, I would just offer, if you haven't already connected with them, Casey Healthy Kids and the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition.
Okay. You said Casey Healthy Kids, and what was the other one?
Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition, because you're working on stuff related to food waste, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think both of them would be great organizations to reach out to try to connect with.
Okay, great, thank you.
Rebecca, you were working on going back up to your to prevent sexual violence and child sexual abuse. Yeah, those are heavy topics. So coalition building and preserving your mental health at the same time is really critical. That will be the first words of advice. I come from working my early years of 25 years ago, working in domestic violence shelters and advocacy, violence against women issues, that it can take a toll. And so I just want to acknowledge that, because those are tough subjects.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that, being truthful in what I've experienced. But I mean, I think it helps me construct another question. How would you go about bringing difficult subjects to communities that you aren't a part of? What, I mean, I kind of get, I guess I get what my question is trying to get across. It's hard sometimes to engage in conversation with people regarding really, really heavy topics and keeping them engaged with what you're saying and what you want to help them with resource wise. So sometimes a little extra advice could be helpful. So.
So I think one way to potentially go about doing it is if there is a way that you can approach a portion of the subject without going all the way into the nitty-gritty of it, like maybe a way to kind of introduce the subject. And sometimes that kind of takes going back to the drawing board and tinkering a little bit, and that's okay. That can be a way to kind of begin to have the conversation, because especially if it's something that is a heavy subject like domestic violence or sexual violence, it is not something that can even really be fully fleshed out in one conversation. And I'm sure Amy can speak to that too. The other thing I would say is I think, especially if it is a heavy subject, I think it might be good to kind of do something a little bit contrarian to what I had said in the presentation. So a lot of times, like coming with like a very brief ask, sometimes it's in that instance, it can be good to come up with a specific policy ask if you have one, just so that you can kind of get something immediate done, show an immediate impact, and then say, because you did this, we can now talk about the next level of that difficult subject. So it's just, if it's like, I think it's okay early on to ask for something like a letter of support in that instance, whereas like if it were active transportation, it's okay to take a little bit of time because you're ultimately trying to build to something. With this, it's because it's a heavier subject, getting something immediate done ingrains them quicker because you need to ingrain them quicker because it's a harder subject that has more nuance, takes more time to fully process. Does that kind of make sense? And Amy, if you, yeah, go ahead.
I would add too, from my experience, those heavy topics, it's like those things that people don't want to talk about, but they are aware of them, but they're sometimes grossly ignorant about the facts. So if you can find more statistics, which statistics can be kind of feel a little cold, but sometimes that's the distance people need between themselves and a really heavy topic. And that way, so that there's this aha when you say, 1 in 3 women are battered by their spouse. That means they're look around in the room. That means, X amount percentage of folks here maybe have experienced or maybe experiencing it. And these are the things that we don't want to talk about, but we need to because. And so I'm usually big about storytelling and going in and like highlighting a specific person, but sometimes this stuff is just too heavy for a group, especially if you're introducing yourself to a group that you're not familiar with or you're not from, which I think was part of your original question. Is, facts and figures can be that attention getter without that feeling of overwhelm. I would say too that people get quickly, they tend to shut down when they feel like something is very hopeless. So trying to offer, here's the stark statistic that kind of snaps people's attention, but then here's what we're working on to address that so that people feel like that there is something that they can do to help versus just feeling so overwhelmed they don't want to hear about it and they turn around and walk away. So really breaking it down into small potential victories and concrete, tangible things will help people get more invested and still feel like they're protecting a bit of their emotional health, if that makes sense. Does that help?
Yeah. Those are both really good answers. They have some points that I would like to bring to my team a little bit more. help them get a better understanding of how we could maybe address some issues we've been having. So yeah.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. So,
what other
well,
questions? We just have a few more minutes.
yeah. So, Melanie, do you have any other questions?
Not that I can think of.
Okay.
Can I offer one more bit of advice? Because this helped me getting into issues, involved in issues that I really am passionate about, is to get your why statement down. Because oftentimes working in the issues that are so close to community, if you can succinctly say why this is important to you, that will help. Just, it's that person to person connection. It's all about relationships. So we talk about active living. Most people are like, that is so lingo. Like, what does that mean? But I can say, my husband commutes by bike. He has been hit 4 times by cars. I will do anything to keep him safe on our roads and not give up something that he absolutely loves. Now suddenly they're like, oh, I understand more a definition of active living, and I understand why you're so passionate about it. It just, those emotional connections I think are important. So get your why statement down, your personal why statement, and ask your team members and your coalition partners too. That's a great opening for a coalition partner meeting. Why are you doing this work? Like, you personally, why is this important? Because this is tough. And it's not well paid, and most people don't want to do it. So I'm interested to know why you're in this fight, and I want to hear your story. And that can help break down barriers too.
Thank you.
Megan, did you have any other questions? Oh, and I think you're muted.
You're on mute. You're sitting on that beautiful enclosed porch.
Yes. No, the power mapping thing was really helpful to me. Like, I may have seen that in my past, but if I did, I couldn't have recalled it. So that visual is very helpful. I also think the why statement, I tend to, when I'm talking to potential coalition members, ask them questions. So, who do you know who's having a hard time getting a house? And then people are like, oh, well, da, 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 da,
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. And then
Yeah.
they're immediately invested with before they even know it. Yeah.
Mhm.
You guys are, I'm really glad that all 3 of you are coming at this with different types of work. I think that just Michael and I get so close to the work that we're doing with built environment improvements and active transportation and active living that we really love hearing what other advocates are doing. So you guys are doing a great job, and I hope this was helpful.
Mhm.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else,
Wow.
Michael? Because you're like, I have learned so much from Michael. I mean, like, I'm old enough to be his mother, but I have learned so much from him.
Well, I don't, the only thing I think I'll just offer is that, it's, there is a responsibility that you have with being a coalition builder. You have a responsibility to be prudent and to an extent to be stingy almost with what you choose to do with other people's efforts, time, and resources. And you really have to try to be cognizant of that. And so as much as we can, whenever we ask a partner to do something, whether it be showing up to city council or to send a letter of support, we do that with the understanding that it is an ask. It is something that is a bigger ask for some than for others, but we do it specifically because it is something that we know as a coalition will help us to get to that next point. And so we don't take that lightly. And like I said, as much as possible, just try to be a responsible steward of what everyone is bringing to the table, because some people really are putting everything there for you, and you have to be mindful of that.
And to thank them. The power of thank you is you can't overestimate or overstate, I guess, how powerful that is.
Mhm.
Yeah, because this is unpaid work for a lot of people. So a thank you, it goes a long, long way.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we have, Michael.
Yeah.
You know how to get
So,
hold of us, you guys. So if you have any questions, feel free. We're happy to share our ideas and thoughts, bounce off ideas. We're all in this together.
yes, and thank you all again for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it. You guys could be anywhere else in the world, but you're here virtually with us, and that really does mean a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Have-
you for making this effort. It's, you know, extra work for you as well.
Well,
So-
it will be recorded in another week, probably week and a half, just because we're a little slammed and understaffed right now. But you will get a link to the recording and the links. So please feel free to share the recording with people who will find it useful, because we want this to be a resource for the community.
Mhm.
Awesome.
And join us for AT 104 in October. So
Definitely.
Sounds
Thanks so
Thank
much.
Thank you.
thank you, everyone.